In a quiet suburban home in Ohio, silence had reigned for years. Margaret, a widow who lost her husband at a young age, dedicated her life to her daughter, Emma, and her grandchildren. As the years passed, silver strands began to weave through her dark hair, yet deep within her heart, the longings of a young woman remained, buried beneath layers of duty and sacrifice. She vividly remembered the first time she laid eyes on her son-in-law, Jake. He had been a young man then, respectful, reserved, and a bit shy. Margaret had tried to see him as a son, but the heart often defies logic. When their eyes met for the first time, she felt a momentary pause in her heart. From that day forward, a quiet fire ignited within her. Jake had always viewed Margaret as a strong, proud woman. Whenever he needed help around the house, she was there, her smile erasing his fatigue. But as the years rolled on, he began to notice something behind that smile, a glimmer of invitation, unspoken words hidden in her gaze. One late afternoon, they found themselves alone in the backyard, the house quiet as Emma and the kids were out. Margaret was watering the flowers, and Jake sat in the corner, watching her. As the last rays of the sun kissed her face, he realized how beautiful she still was, despite her age. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and though neither spoke, an unspoken tension filled the air. From that day, an invisible bond formed between them. Words became less important, their glances spoke volumes. Sometimes, their hands would brush against each other, creating fleeting but unforgettable moments. They both knew this was wrong, yet the heart disregards the rules set by the mind. One evening, after a long family dinner, everyone retreated to their rooms. Margaret was in the kitchen, clearing the table. Jake approached her, offering to help. When their hands met over the same dish, a spark ignited in their eyes, revealing feelings that had been hidden for far too long. Time seemed to stand still. "Let me handle it," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it together," Jake replied, his eyes locked onto hers. The dish slipped from their hands, crashing to the floor, but neither paid attention to the mess. It felt as if the silence of their suppressed emotions had shattered alongside the plate. That night, they said nothing to each other, but neither could sleep. As Jake lay beside Emma, his mind wandered to Margaret's eyes. Meanwhile, Margaret, alone in her room, tried to comprehend the fluttering of her heart, reminiscent of her youth. As time passed, these forbidden feelings only grew stronger. Each encounter, every small touch, fanned the flames of their hidden desire. Yet, they both understood that revealing their secret could tear their family apart. The very danger of their feelings only fueled their passion, for sometimes the greatest desires are born from the most unattainable things. From that day forward, nothing felt the same. Despite their attempts to keep distance, their eyes would always find each other, and even the slightest change in tone would send shivers down their spines. A silent battle had begun. On one side stood logic, family, and conscience, on the other, the heart's insatiable yearning. Margaret began to dress more carefully for breakfast, her hair styled with more attention, a hint of perfume gracing her presence. Jake tried to act as if he noticed nothing, yet his eyes inevitably sought her out. One day, when the house was empty, Emma had gone shopping, and the kids were at school, Jake was in the kitchen making coffee when he saw her. Margaret entered, wearing a light scarf and a tired smile. "Are you making coffee? Should I pour you a cup too?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. "I'd love one." "And a little conversation wouldn't hurt either," Jake replied, sensing the weight of their unspoken connection. They both felt the conversation would be anything but innocent. The kitchen was filled with the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that seemed to echo the unspoken tension between Jake and Margaret. "You know," Margaret said slowly, breaking the silence, "as the years go by, it's easy to lose sight of who you really are. Jake glanced away, his hand trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. "You're a strong woman," he replied, his voice steady but his heart racing. "Do I seem that way?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her tone. "Sometimes, I just wish someone would rest their head on my shoulder." The air thickened with unexpressed feelings, and time felt suspended in the warmth of the kitchen. "Have you ever thought about," Jake hesitated, taking a deep breath, "saying yes to something that seems wrong but feels so right?" Margaret paused, her heart racing at the implication of his words. "I have," she admitted softly, "but I push that thought away every time." Jake reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand. She didn't pull away, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We can't do this," she whispered. "I know," he replied, his voice barely above a murmur. "But my heart doesn't understand." They both fought to suppress the storm of emotions brewing within them, yet each day it became increasingly difficult. At night, when everyone else was asleep, Jake would quietly slip out of bed and sit in the dark kitchen, avoiding the light. A few minutes later, Margaret would join him, as if they had an unspoken agreement. They would sit in silence, sometimes their hands would graze against each other, and those moments felt like a lifetime. One afternoon, while their daughter was rummaging through old photo albums, she laughed and exclaimed, "Mom, you were so beautiful when you were young. Look at this picture, you look just like a movie star." Jake, who happened to be in the room, glanced over and swallowed hard at the sight of Margaret's youthful smile. That smile, that posture, it hadn't faded with time. At night, that image lingered in Jake's mind. He longed to touch her hand, to run his fingers through her hair, but he always held back. It was forbidden, yet not impossible. One day, they found themselves alone in the backyard. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves as Margaret knitted, and Jake worked on a small repair project. Suddenly, Margaret accidentally hit her hand with a nail and gasped in pain. Jake rushed over, concern etched on his face. "Let me see," he said, kneeling beside her. Blood trickled from her hand. "Everything will be okay," she whispered, trying to reassure him. But the look in her eyes told a different story. Jake grasped her hand tightly. "Forgive me," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But I can't stop thinking about you," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the ground. When she finally looked up, they both spoke the truth they had kept hidden for so long. In that secluded corner of the garden, beneath the shadows, their lips didn't meet, but their unvoiced desires collided. Instead, Margaret leaned her forehead against Jake's chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, creating a moment that silenced the universe. But fear quickly followed, breaking the spell. "We can't continue this," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I don't want it to end," Jake replied, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "What will happen?" "I don't know," he confessed. "But feeling this way reminds me that I'm alive." From that moment, they made a pact. They would try to suppress their feelings for each other, but they would cherish every moment like a precious treasure. However, fate had other plans. One evening, their daughter announced she and her husband were taking a spontaneous trip out of town for a few days. That night, the house felt eerily quiet, more so than ever before. It was as if the walls were holding their breath, preparing to witness what was to come. As rain softly tapped against the windows, Margaret was closing the curtains while Jake heated water in the kitchen. They hadn't exchanged a single glance all day, but the silence between them spoke volumes, as if two hearts were communicating without words. "Do you need anything?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I just want a little silence," Margaret replied, but neither of them could find peace within. The silence had become the loudest cry of their repressed emotions. They settled into the living room, the television flickering in the background, but neither was watching the screen. Their eyes darted away from each other, yet their thoughts were intertwined, creating an invisible bond that neither could break. Margaret sighed, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words. "This shouldn't be happening," she said, her voice weary. But it was too late for that sentiment. It felt like a door had been cracked open, revealing a world of emotions she had long buried. "I've always tried to do the right thing. I raised my daughter alone, putting myself second. My dreams, my desires, my youth, all of it came after." Jake lowered his gaze, the floor suddenly more interesting than the woman sitting beside him. "But you're still beautiful," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her like that, a long time since she felt a flutter in her heart. He shifted closer on the couch, just a cushion's width apart. "When I see you, I don't just see my mother-in-law. I see a woman." She couldn't meet his eyes for a moment, then slowly turned her head away. In that instant, all their pasts, regrets, and suppressed feelings intertwined in a silent exchange. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing against her palm. It felt like a spark, igniting something that had been dormant for years. "This will be our secret, won't it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," he replied softly. "But it's a secret that will live between us forever." He leaned in, pressing his lips gently against her forehead. It wasn't a kiss, it was a surrender. "I've been alone for so long," she confessed. "People were around me, but no one touched my heart." "You did." Jake closed his eyes, absorbing her words. "I'm afraid of loving you, but I'm also incapable of feeling anything else." Margaret smiled faintly. "Sometimes the heart doesn't know right from wrong, it just desires." That night was perhaps the most dangerous yet honest night of their lives. No more words were needed. They embraced in silence, the weight of their emotions filling the space around them. Margaret rested her head on Jake's shoulder, her eyes fluttering shut as he gently stroked her back. It was more than just a physical touch, it was the release of years of pent-up feelings. Time seemed to stand still as raindrops slid down the window, mirroring the tears they shed on each other's shoulders. The next morning, as the sun rose, nothing was said. Yet both of their eyes were filled with the memories of the night before. While preparing breakfast, Margaret noticed Jake quietly sitting at the table. "Everything feels the same, but nothing is the same," he said, breaking the silence. She didn't respond, merely slicing bread, the weight of their unspoken truth hanging heavily in the air. "There's no turning back now," he added, his voice low. "Let it be," she replied, knowing that their lives would now tread more carefully. From that day forward, everything in the house felt more deliberate. Glances were hidden, touches became tentative, yet inside, storms raged. One evening, while looking in the mirror, Margaret spoke to herself. "This isn't right. But my heart has forgotten how to beat any other way." Meanwhile, Jake sat in the living room, scrolling through family photos on his phone. His eyes lingered on the pictures where Margaret appeared, each one a reminder of the bond they shared. One morning, Margaret decided to step outside. "I'm going to get some fresh air," she said. "Can I come with you?" Jake asked. They both stepped into the garden. They walked under the old trees in the park, side by side, without saying a word, their hands brushing against each other without fully connecting. Yet that slight contact was intoxicating enough. When they finally sat on a bench, Margaret spoke softly. "We can't fool ourselves. This will end one day. Let it end, but let the memory remain." Jake pulled out a small notebook from his jacket. "I've been writing to you every night. Things I can't say out loud." Margaret looked at the notebook, her hands trembling as she took it from him. Pages filled with emotions, poetry, confessions. She pressed the notebook to her heart. "I've never received a letter from a man before," she admitted. Jake's eyes glistened. "It's the first time I've written my true feelings to a woman." At that moment, the sky clouded over, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves around them. But the hearts of the two sitting on the bench felt as warm as the sun. This relationship seemed impossible to explain, impossible to live out loud. Yet inside, it had already blossomed. That night, Margaret prayed in her bed. "God, I don't want to ask for something wrong, but if loving someone is a crime, forgive me." And in that moment, she made a decision. Even if this relationship would one day come to an end, she would cherish every moment they had. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Margaret stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. Her eyes lingered on her reflection, tracing the lines that hinted at her age and the dark circles beneath her eyes. Yet, behind those signs of weariness, there was a flicker of something vibrant, a heart that beat with the enthusiasm of youth, a spirit that had found a reason to wake up each day. She confessed to herself, "I remember what it feels like to be a woman again, and this realization is the most beautiful thing I've experienced." Meanwhile, Jake had risen early that morning, preparing breakfast. The table was set for two, their coffee cups waiting. An unspoken rhythm had developed between them, a connection that felt both familiar and exhilarating. When Margaret entered the kitchen and saw the spread, a smile crept onto her face. "Do you want to go somewhere today?" Jake asked, glancing up from the stove. "Where to?" she replied, curiosity piqued. "I don't know. Maybe somewhere quiet, by the sea?" Margaret hesitated, her heart fluttering at the thought. "We can't run away forever. No matter what, we'll have to return. But one day, at least for one day, I want to be with you." She lowered her head, warmth spreading through her chest at the thought of their time together. That day, they ventured to a quaint little tea house just outside the city, perched on a small hill. It was a serene place, steeped in history, where time seemed to stand still. They ordered 2 cups of tea, the aroma enveloping them in comfort. "Do you think what we have is wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake gazed into the distance, contemplating her question. "If we're going to blame our hearts, then why live at all?" Margaret took a sip of her tea, her thoughts drifting to her daughter. "If my daughter knew, she would be devastated. I feel like I'm betraying my husband every day. But when did he ever look at me like this? When did he see me as a person?" Jake reached out, placing his hand over hers. "Then let's just live in this moment." Silence enveloped them as tears began to well in Margaret's eyes. "Is it too late for me to be loved? Is it worse than never being loved at all?" With a trembling hand, she grasped Jake's, resting her head on his shoulder. The moment was a blend of long-suppressed love, desire, and sorrow. They walked side by side for a long time without speaking, not holding hands or making eye contact, but both aware that their connection was profound. They knew this relationship would eventually end, but that day was not today. When they returned home, the sky had darkened, and they quietly retreated to their separate rooms. But later that night, Margaret found herself wandering into the kitchen. Jake followed shortly after. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, sitting down at the table without turning on the light. The darkness of the night felt like a secret they shared. Jake stood up, his voice steady. "I don't want to hide anymore." Margaret averted her gaze. "But we can't explain this." He stepped closer, his presence warm and inviting. "Then let's just live it." Silently, but fully. Margaret took a deep breath, her heart racing. "My daughter will be back soon. Everything will return to normal. Will our hearts go back too?" No, Jake replied softly, shaking his head. They won't. In that moment, Margaret placed her trembling hands on his chest. This heart reminds me how to beat again after all these years. It brings me back to life, but it's also tearing me apart. Jake held her hands gently. Then let's piece ourselves together. Every night, every morning, in our glances. Margaret closed her eyes, leaning in to softly touch her lips to his cheek. It was a lingering caress, filled with the longing of the past, the helplessness of the present, and the uncertainty of the future. Was this a farewell? No, it was an acceptance. That night, for the first time, Margaret didn't feel alone. But when morning came, a different silence filled the house. The phone rang, breaking the stillness. Margaret answered, her heart sinking as she learned that her daughter's children were sick and they wouldn't be coming home. As she hung up, tears welled in her eyes. They had more time together, but it was not a joy, it was a worry. Time was now offering them more moments, but each moment drew them closer together. Jake approached her, his expression earnest. Every day, I find myself loving you a little more. Margaret rested her head against his chest, whispering, I'm learning for the first time how painful it can be to love you. Margaret and Jake had found a rhythm in their secret moments together, sharing quiet evenings and long walks under the sprawling oak trees of their small town in Texas. Their connection was like a forbidden melody, one that resonated deeply within them, yet they both understood that life had a way of interrupting even the sweetest songs. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the doorbell rang, shattering the tranquility of their shared space. Margaret's heart raced, she felt as if the very air had been knocked out of her lungs. The sound of that doorbell, so familiar over the years, now felt like a harbinger of change. Jake stood frozen in the living room, his eyes wide with uncertainty. When Margaret opened the door, her daughter, Emily, stood there, a bright smile on her face. Surprise! We're back, she exclaimed, her voice bubbling with joy. The kids are better, and we thought we'd come home early. Margaret forced a smile, but the lines on her face betrayed the storm brewing inside her heart. Welcome home, she managed, as the house suddenly filled with the laughter of children and the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen. Yet amidst the chaos, Margaret and Jake felt like two lonely souls, silently yearning for each other in a crowded room. That first night, as the house settled into a familiar rhythm of family life, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, while Jake stood by the window, smoking a cigarette and gazing into the night. At breakfast the next morning, the table was filled with cheerful chatter, but Margaret felt a profound emptiness. The glances she and Jake exchanged were now laden with unspoken words, a language only they understood. Later that evening, Jake found her sitting alone in the garden, the stars twinkling above them. We need to talk, he said, his voice low and serious. Margaret didn't look up, knowing what was coming. We can't deny what we feel for each other, but we have to protect this family, this home. Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks, falling softly onto the ground. The weight of her heart felt unbearable. Letting go of you feels like the greatest punishment I could inflict on myself, she whispered. Jake knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. I'll carry you in my heart for the rest of my life. If only we had met at a different time, in a different place. Margaret nodded, feeling the truth in his words. At least one more night, she replied softly. Just one more night with you. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. After a long pause, she finally agreed, one last night. That night, while everyone else slept, Margaret found herself sitting by the window, lost in thought. Jake quietly entered her room, and without a word, they embraced, holding each other tightly as if to freeze time. I loved you, she murmured, her fingers running through his hair. If I could live this life again, I would choose you every time. Jake kissed her hands gently, his eyes filled with unshed tears. You've become the most beautiful secret of my life. When dawn broke, Margaret rose early, preparing tea and taking one last look around the house that had been her sanctuary. She approached Emily, her voice steady. I think I need to go away for a while, she said. Just to rest and find myself. Why? Emily asked, concern etched on her face. Just to breathe, Margaret replied, and no one questioned her. She packed her bags, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. As she said her goodbyes, she locked eyes with Jake one last time. Take care of yourself, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You too, she replied, stepping onto the train that would take her away. As the train pulled away, an elderly man sitting next to her asked, Long journey? Margaret nodded, her heart aching. The longest of my life. Jake returned to his quiet existence, the silence of his home now a constant reminder of what he had lost. His wife remained blissfully unaware, but a shadow of sorrow settled in his eyes. Meanwhile, Margaret rented a small apartment in a new city, filling her balcony with flowers and pouring her heart into a journal each night. I still love him, she wrote, but this love is now a silent poem, read only by me. Each year, she remembered that last night, that final gaze, that last touch. Some loves are never meant to be lived out loud, they linger in the heart, echoing like a shadow that first appears at dawn, only to be remembered when the sun rises. Subscribe to the channel,